Babies. We're having less of them. Around the world, fertility rates are dropping. In many countries, the number of births per woman is below the 2.1 level needed to maintain population numbers. Governments are trying to reverse the trend, with apparently little success. But should they even bother? How cataclysmic is a future with a smaller, older population? And if there is going to be more shuffling of orthopedic shoes and less pitter-pattering of tiny feet, what can governments do to address that economic reality? Let's try and find out. It's what we do here on Reuters Econ World. Every week, we pick a phrase or buzzword and go deep on the economic principles and ideas driving the biggest news around the world. So this week, the baby slump. I'm your host, Carmel Crimmins in Dublin. Concerns about population stretch back to the 18th century English economist Thomas Malthus. He believed that population growth would swamp food supply, leading to mass starvation. In the 1960s, Stanford biologist Paul Ehrlich wrote The Population Bomb, warning of something similar. Fast forward to the present day, and concerns about population have been flipped on their head. The concern now is about falling population levels as fertility levels drop, particularly in the world's richest countries. Elon Musk is worried. So too is Pope Francis.
Queste famiglie preferiscono avere un gatto o un cagnolino e non un figlio.
That's the Pope in Jakarta, praising Indonesians for having large families and suggesting people in other countries prefer having pets to children. That idea has become political fodder in the United States. J.D. Vance, the Republican vice presidential candidate, has faced a wave of criticism for past comments referring to some prominent Democrats as childless cat ladies. There are many reasons for falling fertility rates: financial, cultural, and deeply personal. We're not getting into them on this show. We're looking instead at the potential economic fallout from falling birth rates and ageing populations. And I'm joined today by David Miles, a professor of financial economics at Imperial College in London. He's someone who sees a positive impact on the economy from fewer people. David, welcome.
It's a pleasure.
So David, globally the population is still growing and it's likely to, keep growing for around 50 or 60 years, peaking at about 10.3 billion. Then the UN thinks it's going to start to decline gradually. But we're seeing so many warnings about declining fertility levels. Are we facing a new population time bomb?
Well, it's certainly true that in some countries, given where the fertility rates are right now, the population will gradually decline by 30 or 40 years from now, will be a material amount.
Yeah.
For the world as a whole, that's not true. So it's misleading sometimes to read stuff in the media about, oh, we're running out of people, there's not enough children being born. For the world as a whole, there's plenty enough children being born. In fact, all those worries about population explosions, environmental damage, the difficulties of dealing with climate change with a growing population, they are absolutely still in place, all those worries.
Okay, so for the world as a whole, you say it's not a problem. But what about for those individual countries that are seeing falling birth rates? Is it economically terrible for them?
I would say not. First of all, it happens relatively gradually. We're not talking about enormous declines in population in a short period of time, like 3, 4, 5 years. So this will be, if it does happen, fertility rates stay low, and that's not offset by big net immigration. It will be gradual declines in populations. Now, one worry that people have is, well, there won't be enough people working to look after a combination of the young and the old who need to be supported. I think that's a bit overplayed.
Right.
Because it depends partly what you mean by old. I mean, if you go back 30 or 40 years, the average age at which people died in even rich countries was maybe 10 years lower than it is now. I mean, it would have been kind of mid-late 60s, and now it's kind of late 70s, indeed, in many countries, the low 80s. And so the idea that there's a kind of fixed age that once you get to 63, 64, people will stop working, I think is a misguided one. There may be economic incentives why people do that. It's partly an indication of the richness of the modern world relative to where we were decades ago.
Yeah.
But that can change. And if there is a shortage of labor, then wages will get bid up. That will encourage people to stay in the workforce a little bit longer. There probably will be ongoing adjustments in state pensions, which will get paid a bit later. So I think it's perfectly feasible for there to be an adjustment, maybe a significant adjustment over time in people's work patterns over their life.
But there is one economic logic, though. When if a population declines, it is bad for economic growth, right? There's kind of three drivers of economic growth: population, participation, productivity. And so if the population declines, economic growth falls too, right?
Well, it depends how you measure economic growth. I mean, if you measure it in terms of the total output, then you're right. But that's not a very good way of thinking about the quality of life of different countries. I mean, if it were, you'd say the quality of life in India is dramatically higher than it is in Switzerland, which is obviously nonsense. Then Nigeria would be the most successful country in the world at the moment. And it's not.
Right.
So it's GDP per capita. It's the average quality of life for the people that are in the country that is a much better gauge of quality of life, standard of living, than aggregate GDP. So it's not at all the case that GDP per person necessarily grows less or even declines when the population declines a bit. And indeed, there are some reasons to think it may be the opposite of that.
Are we obsessed with GDP growth?
To some extent, yes, particularly if it's focused on aggregate total GDP.
Yeah.
I mean, it always makes sense to adjust for changes in the population. So, if you look back over the last 30 years, people have got this idea in their minds that Japan has been a disaster.
Yeah.
And it hasn't been a disaster, because if you adjust for the fact that the population in Japan has been stagnant and maybe probably in more recent years, maybe it's even declined a bit, you've got to adjust those growth in GDP numbers for the percentage change in the population. And so once you do that, Japan doesn't look like it's had a particularly bad few decades relative to most of the richer countries that it gets compared with.
And standards of living there haven't declined, am I right?
I mean, that's right. I mean, again, if one reads quite a lot of the media, you get the impression that Japan has been a basket case since the late 1980s.
Yeah.
If you go to Japan, it clearly does not look like a basket case. I mean, people are well educated. Stuff works. I mean, you compare it with most European countries, and you would die for the infrastructure in Japan. I mean, if a train in Japan is 5 minutes late, there's a national inquiry as to why. If a train in the UK is 5 minutes late, people rejoice and say, that's a miracle.
You made headlines, I think, last year for some research that you did, suggesting that falling population numbers might bring us some benefits.
Yeah.
Can you explain how you came to that conclusion?
I mean, yeah, I think there's a bunch of different reasons. I mean, one is we talked earlier a little bit about environmental damage and climate change and dealing with that and having net zero targets.
Yeah.
I mean, self-evidently, all those aims for dealing with climate change become much, much more difficult to meet if the population is rising significantly. It just keeps going up and up and up.
Mm-hmm.
So that's one big reason why we should see slower growth in population, possibly even declines in population, as bringing some advantages. But that's not the only issue. I mean, if one thinks about affordability of housing, I mean, many countries in Europe, the UK is certainly one of them, are densely populated. If the population keeps rising, and you're trying to preserve green belts around cities and have a sense of a countryside, then you've got a conflict between trying to keep house prices down, which might involve building lots more houses every year, year after year after year.
Yeah.
Conflict between that and people's ability to get out of towns into the countryside. So that's pretty obvious in many countries. And that all gets much more difficult when population just goes up and up and up. There's another factor, which is if the population keeps rising, in order to maintain the level of what you might call physical infrastructure, so the road network, the power generation network, electricity supply, the housing stock, you have to keep investing to maintain the structures relative to the population of the country.
Yeah. I mean, just to explain to listeners as well, so what you're talking about there is if you don't have to invest as much for the future, then you have more to consume now, right?
Essentially, yes.
And that means then that, say, your standard of living now rises.
Right.
Right. Well, talk to me about the disadvantages from a falling population.
Well, I mean, in the extreme, of course, if the fertility rate is extremely low and you project that ahead, again, in the absence of a very large-scale net migration into a country, it is true that the size of the labor force is likely to fall relative to the population. The population will become older.
Yeah.
And, 30, 40 years from now, it may be that if you take, let's say, the population aged over 65 relative to the population under 65, then that will be much higher.
Yeah.
I mean, in a sense, if you stop producing children, of course, everybody's going to get to 65. There'll be nobody under 65, in a kind of ludicrous science fiction world. And if you take that to extremes, then that does generate a problem. You do need people to do the work. And if there are very, very few people aged between, let's say, 20 and 70 relative to the 70 pluses, that's going to cause strains. Now, I don't think that issue is one you can't deal with, given the likely evolution of the populations in Europe, where the fertility rates are, 1.6, 1.7 in many countries. That will mean a slow change in the demographic structure. It will become older, but I think that can be offset by people just getting used to it,
right?
Working a bit for more years in their life and retiring a bit later.
Right. What about for governments, though? I suppose that there is the fiscal burden. There's the worry that if you've, reduced the number of workers who can support the number of retirees, that's a bit of a problem, right?
Well, it is. You're right. And you need to make adjustments. You can't just ignore that and carry on in a world where, from age 60, everybody receives a whole state pension.
Yeah.
Now, that's going to get increasingly difficult if the proportion of people over 60 relative to the population keeps going up.
Thomas Malthus thought human misery, by which he meant war, famine and disease, would limit population growth. But in South Korea, lifestyle priorities are playing a big role. The country is an extreme example of the demographic transition. Fertility rates there are dropping dramatically and currently stand at 0.72. Faced with a tough economic environment, sociologists say young Koreans prefer to live in the here and now than save and plan for children in an uncertain future. Ji-hoon Lee in Seoul took a look at the "you only live once" or YOLO generation.
So I went to this fashion festival in Seoul held last month, and I met a woman in her late 20s whose name is Park Yeon, and she said she's all about YOLO. And to be clear, she's not pessimistic or against marriage or children, but then she hopes to get married at some point, but she just says there are so many uncertainties. So that's why she wants to live her life to the fullest now and focus on her dream job, enjoy herself at the moment. Data clearly shows that it is a widespread phenomenon. So in recent years, the economy was hit by high inflation globally and of course in Korea. And in Korea, it was interesting to see that people in 20s and 30s, they were the only age group whose savings declined while spendings rose. And that was contrary to data in other countries. Their spendings rose, especially at high-end department stores and fancy restaurants and overseas travelings.
So, David, do you think governments should be getting involved in trying to raise birth rates?
I'm skeptical about that, partly because the idea that there's a terrible crisis because fertility rates have gone less than 2 for the reasons we've discussed is overblown. And therefore, some panic reaction by governments, we have to subsidize people to have, 3 children and all that, I think is a bit mistaken. It's also the case that the decline in fertility is overwhelmingly a reflection of choice made by largely women, which reflects good things that have happened in recent decades. better job opportunities, better educational attainment for women relative to men, more women at universities, greater choices. And so to look at that and say, oh my goodness, that's a disaster, we must try and offset all that, seems a bit perverse to me.
From what I can see, looking at the birth rates in East Asia and in Europe, there hasn't been much success either in these policies, right? They've been throwing a lot of cash incentives at people, tax credits and things. Doesn't seem to be making a difference.
Yeah, I mean, my guess is, but this is like amateur sociology more than it is economics. My guess is that if you really want to change incentives purely through financial means, I mean, making another $500, another $1,000 tax difference to having, 2 kids rather than 1 just is not going to do this. That's not going to move the dial. And
it's I mean, we are talking like economics here and the financial mix, but it's important to say, of course, that having kids is a deeply personal choice as well, right? Like sometimes it just does not come down to money.
Of course.
And there is that aspect to it.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah.
As I say, you seem sort of relaxed about where we're headed, but do you worry about, the idea that a smaller population means less innovation and an aging population means less innovation? In other words, the young people are the ones who come up with the great ideas. They're the risk takers.
Yeah.
The entrepreneurs.
So I think this issue about, the young people are the ones with the ideas and the energy and they're the entrepreneurs and then we're going to run out of young people.
Mm-hmm.
For the world as a whole, it's just way off, I think, in any sort of foreseeable future where you can make any kind of reliable predictions. And it isn't as if every country has to have lots of young people to come up with great ideas, because ideas move across the world more easily now than has ever been true in history, I think.
True.
And so because there's no shortage of young people for the world as a whole, I would say this concern, the young people have the ideas, there aren't enough of them. Again, it seems to me to be just a bit misplaced and overblown.
And we touched on a little bit, you did refer about some of the things that could be done to alleviate the kind of the economic negative impacts of this. But for you, if maybe we could recap them. So what do you think governments should be doing?
I think a lot of the things that will happen naturally are economic forces that actually government would do best just to not interfere with.
Okay.
I mean, so for example, higher real wages in a world in which there might be labour shortages will tend to bring forth more work from the elderly who may just decide, well, I don't want to retire.
Right. So increase the participation rate to kind of go back to what those economic growth drivers would be.
Yeah, and I think increasing the participation rate, I mean, it's a bit like how many kids do people want to have?
Yeah.
It's probably overwhelmingly a personal decision and not something that governments can kind of move some lever, fiddle with the tax system a bit and change people's incentives. If there is a shortage of labour, markets will work. Real wages will be higher to the benefit, actually, of the working population.
Yeah.
And more people who might have retired at, 62 or 63 will decide, well, actually, I'll stay on a bit. And if there is a shortage of labour, companies will increasingly look toward older workers and offer contracts which give people some flexibility. Might not want to work 40 hours a week, 35 hours a week.
Yeah.
Work half time, work from home a bit more. Jobs will be tailored to where the supply of labour is in a world where there's a shortage of labour.
Yeah.
And that's not a bad thing for labour. It's a big advantage to be born in a generation that's small. There's a lot of economic evidence for that.
That's it for this week's show. Thank you to Professor David Miles for a fascinating discussion. A big shout out too to Theodore Walljasper for his podcast debut. He's responsible for the cooing, gurgling and feed me I'm hungry sounds at the start of this pod. His dad, Chris Walljasper, helped produce this show, in between diaper changing duties. Sound design, music composition and engineering on this episode was by Josh Summer. Our podcast team includes Kim Vanell, Tara Oakes, Gail Issa, Jonah Green, David Spencer and Sharon Wright Garson. Our executive producer is Leela de Kretzer. Remember, for all your daily news, check out our weekday show, Reuters World News. You can catch it on the Reuters app or wherever you listen to your podcasts.